My name's Jamie Hakim. I'm a lecturer in media studies at the University of East Anglia, actually shortly moving to King's in a couple of weeks. I'm also a member of the Care Collective, along with Joe, who you've just seen, and Catherine Rottenberg, Andreas Hatzidakis, and Lynn Siegel. And it's a great pleasure for me to be here and have attended that last panel, and also to be chairing what also looks like to be, which looks like a great kind of set of papers on kind of different issues relating to care. So we'll follow the same pattern as the last panel.
So I'm a DPhil student at Oxford in anthropology, and my research focuses mainly on masculinity and gender relations in the Pakistani middle class. Although this paper focuses more on just women, but for my research, therefore, I interviewed both men and women, and we talked a lot about the gender division of labor, obviously. As I was interviewing people, I realized that the issue of whether middle-class women in Pakistan will be allowed to work after they marry is an incredibly hot topic. Hold on, I was planning to have some slides for you here. So what I realized as I was interviewing people is that the issue of whether women will be allowed to work after they get married is a very hot topic. It's something that everybody was talking about and debating a lot, and also as my fieldwork was progressing, I discovered that young unmarried women and girls were incredibly eager to have a job after they married, and they were talking a lot about getting a good education, using that education in an interesting job in the labor market. And they were using a lot of energy on influencing their mothers to extract promises from potential suitors that they would be allowed to work after they got married. And in Pakistan, there's been a lot of focus on educating women that goes back all the way to the colonial era. And more recently, that's been taken up by NGOs and development organizations. So women are often seen as this untapped resource for capitalism. For example, the World Bank has called Pakistani women an economic and social strategy. And in Pakistan, by people we talk to in Pakistan, when women don't end up working after marrying, it's often seen as an individual failure on their part. So as if they made the wrong choice and just wasted their education. But as my fieldwork progressed, I realized that the reasons women quit their jobs are obviously a lot more complex. It can't be reduced to individual reasons, nor is it really a question of just being allowed by husbands or in-laws. And as I was doing this fieldwork, I was also living a lot of the issues that these women were talking about, which kind of brought all this out much more strongly for me, because I came to my fieldwork with my family, including a 2.5-year-old child. And when I arrived, I was shocked to discover that my son would be able to go to school, or like the kindergarten thing, for 2.5 hours a day, which was basically enough for me to check my email and go and pick him up again. So I was, a lot of the stuff was stuff that I was actually experiencing myself. And then the question is, why do women leave the labor market? Oops, there. Yeah, so why do women leave their jobs in Pakistan? And the first big issue that people talked about is respectability, which is in Pakistan is really important because it's tied to status and to social accept. And this is also tied to division of labor at home. So having a woman at home, a wife at home doing the childcare and the housework, and a husband who's the breadwinner is the division of labor that gives the most respect. And that's also tied to Islamic gender norms, which basically have the same ideals. And on top of that, working away from home risks sexual harassment for women, which again puts the family's respectability at risk. And then the second thing that people talked about, which is a very big issue, was the double burden of housework and paid work. So like elsewhere in the world, women in Pakistan do most of the housework and care work at home. And in Pakistan, this is completely considered women's work. It's considered beneath men to do that kind of work and to do housework and childcare, and they lose masculinity points if they do it, which kind of indicates the incredibly low value connected to it. It's also considered women's job to care for in-laws whom they often live with. So doing things like serving them tea, giving them massages, taking time to sit and talk to them. And also it's often expected that the women themselves cook the food for them and for the husband. And although the middle class usually has some higher domestic help, it's still considered the woman's job to care for the children, to cook and do various other tasks at home themselves. So there's a significant second shift, which is an important reason why women just felt they didn't have the energy and time to have both a job and keep up with the second shift at home. There was one woman in particular who I remember who told me that she would actually cook in the middle of the night to get everything done, because she was a doctor. She would take her babies with her to the clinic while they were sleeping in order to do deliveries and small operations and stuff. And she said for a while she would only sleep for 2-3 hours a day at a time. And then the third issue is that the workplace in Pakistan assumes that the ideal worker is a male who is unencumbered by housework and care work responsibilities. So that means the work hours tend to be from 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. plus travel time. And with all their responsibilities at home, women found it impossible to work these kinds of hours. And men said that they were too tired to from their long working hours to help out at home. So this, I found that really exposed the way that capitalism really relies on the unpaid labor that women do at home to function. It's assumed that these men can work long hours because they have women at home who serve them food and take care of the children. And then the fourth thing that came out during my interviews was that was the severe lack of childcare and adequate parental leaves. So in Pakistan, the state relies on women and the family to care for children, and there are very few decent childcare facilities in Lahore. They're usually understaffed and underfunded and not a place that you really want to leave your child. So most people have to rely on their female family members, either a mother-in-law, a mother, or maybe a sister-in-law to watch their children while they go to work. But that doesn't always work out because a mother-in-law might be unwilling, which is not unusual. A mother may be elderly or unwell, or she may live too far away. So then suddenly you have no childcare. And on top of that, parental leaves are incredibly short. Like women just get 3 months for the first child, and then it decreases progressively for each child after that. But 6 of the weeks have to be taken before the child is born, and 6 of the weeks are to be taken after. And as anybody who's given birth can attest to, you're not really ready to go back to work full time after 6 weeks, and certainly not necessarily very eager to leave your child, your 6-week-old, for 10 hours a day. So it's widely recognized, of course, that care work is undervalued, and that's the case in Pakistan too. It's often not even considered real work. Men, for example, seem to think of women as relaxing at home while they're at work sweating and working long hours to feed the family. But in Pakistan, women's incomes aren't really valued either. So it seems like the respectability gained from keeping women at home is often of higher value to families and to men. Because they, men get more respect if they are the main breadwinner. So a working woman does not really help the family's respect. So this ideology of respectability also helps to maintain the status quo. It means that there seems to be no reason to change the idea of the ideal worker being male, nor is there any reason to set up proper childcare or maternity leaves, because women take care of that. So together, these factors make it very difficult for women to keep down a job. But as Pamela Stone has argued, it's one should rather, and it's not really an individual choice that women are making or a free choice. It's rather that they're being pushed out of the labor market by these inhospitable conditions that they find there. And then, of course, along came the pandemic, which massively increased women's care work at home. So in Pakistan, a lot of middle class men have been working from home for most of the last year, and schools have been closed for most of the last year. The schools have only occasionally been open. So children and men at home, of course, meant a lot more cooking, a lot more cleaning, and also things like men asking for cut fruit and tea while they were working, which a lot of men enjoyed, and while women found it a bit taxing. But on top of that, of course, women have mostly been the ones who had to take care of homeschooling and keeping the children entertained while they were home. And whenever people were sick with COVID, it was usually women who had to care for the sick, even if they were sick themselves. I talked to several women who themselves had high fevers, but still had to care for the men who were sick. So during the early pandemic, people also often managed without the domestic help they usually have. So that meant that women were not only doing the extra work brought on by the pandemic, but also the extra work that the paid help would usually do. So in Europe and America, people have argued that the pandemic has exposed the undervalued nature of care work, and that it's made gender inequalities much more evident because the complicated childcare puzzles that make women able to hold down jobs fell apart. But in Pakistan, the pandemic hasn't really made anything evident that wasn't known before, as far as I can tell, but it has severely increased women's care work, which means that the cost of holding on to this dream of having a job has become even higher. So to answer the question of whether Parveen can come out to play, unfortunately, she tends to be so overburdened with reproductive labor and care work that she doesn't feel like she has time to do what she'd like to do, which is to pursue a career. Thank you.
Thanks, Cecilie. Okay. So yes, themes already emerging from the two talks. Cecilie, so we will now move to our next speakers. I have Ashwin Tripathi from the Indian Institute of Technology, and Tannistha Samanta from Flame University Pune. And the title is Self-Care in Times of the Pandemic. So over to you guys.
Hello everyone, again, I'm a PhD student studying time use among older adults in India, and I specifically focus on leisure time, how people use their free time, and that is among older adults. And in the process, I also try to understand what are the meanings of leisure from a global south perspective. And for today, I'll be presenting a working paper, which I'm working with Professor Samanta, which is based on our recent pilot data, where we recorded an increased focus on self, and particularly self-care among the older adults in India. So before going into the detail, the motivation behind this discussion emerges from this from time allocation of work, both paid and unpaid work within household, which I feel other presenters have also discussed, and where I'm sure that we all have come across, and we know how women are household work and major burden of household chores, and especially during the pandemic. And taking this as the motivation, we are taking a slightly different angle, where we see that how, if at all, this is generalizable in others across other social differentials, and we see how, if at all, it affects or varies across social class and age. And so these were the questions that we focus on in our paper, and also led to the working of the paper, where we focus on how the unpaid work and care activities is experienced by the upper middle classes in India, and is it the same for the young adults and old adults, and if how older adults are allocating their time during the lockdown. Are these activities gendered, and specifically their leisure activities? And has the pandemic in any way forged a renewed interest in care and self-efficacy, if at all? So my sample population is older adults. So these were the questions, and before going into more details, I would briefly set the stage from for where I placed my study. The study traces the changes that are brought by the neoliberal economy, which has brought into forefront the consumer market and greater individualization. And in case of India, that has been referred to the economic reforms of 1991, which have drastically reshaped the middle class imagination and also led to the enhanced the consumeristic aspirations, the lifestyle and leisure practices have also altered a lot. And I'm focusing on this particular generation of which are demographically referred as baby boomers, who experience these changes in India on the first-hand level. And I try to study if those consumeristic practices in terms of their leisure aspirations, if they continue to exist, and if at all they are greatly influenced by the market. In the scholarship of social aging, they are referred to as third agers, third age specifically, and these are a particular cohort of older adults which are defined by their consumeristic practices. And third age is very interesting in the sense that it also allows us to have an alternative view of aging, because they depict not dependent or weak older adults or people who are in need of support, but active adults who are taking charge of their life, health, and well-being. And they contribute to the broader paradigm of successful aging, leading to the process of new aging, where the focus has been on health. And when we focus on health, there is an enhanced realization towards self and self-care, which is strongly linked and related with the neoliberal idea, where neoliberalism focuses on how the state's role has shifted towards enabling and facilitating state. And we see an increased focus on the will to health. And many scholars have stated this as a neoliberal governmentality, where the emphasis and the responsibilities of the self are on the subject. And they try to push forward this enterprising consumeristic aspiration, which should be bolstered by the subject itself. In nutshell, what we see and how neoliberalism affects the idea of self is that you are expected to be active, mobile, and autonomous, and contribute to your own well-being. And at the same time, the ideas of vulnerabilities and dependencies are problematized. So basically what happens is the notions of autonomy, choice, and self-improvement, they sit side by side with surveillance, discipline, and vilification of those who are making wrong choices. And so these are the theoretical background of my study. Moving on to the study, the project which was conducted, this was the pilot study that was conducted starting last year from September till February this year. And the data that I'll be sharing in the coming slides are from time use diaries, which was collected from 30 adults. The data was collected from the urban cities in India, and also some data was also collected through surveys. We particularly recruited participants who were free of any limitations in terms of they were able to do their daily activities, and also language barrier was also taken into consideration. And in the next slide, I'll be sharing a few excerpts from the interviews that I took. And before going into the details of the excerpts, what we see is that how among older adults we see, and this was the data that was collected during the lockdown, where during the pandemic, the older adults were more vulnerable. We see that an increased digital leisure among older adults was seen. There was more socialization and active engagement, although through online portals. And in many ways, few of the older adults, few of my informants shared that how their subjective well-being has improved because they have realized, or because they have been staying alone in their homes, and how they are able to make sense of their everyday life. These are few other excerpts where one of the older adults, a 72-year-old male focus, says that how he is too much into gymming, and then he puts a considerable amount of his time working out, while the other female, a 74-year-old female, says that she tries to take care of herself through preventive measures and not through medications. So see, these were a few of the excerpts from the interview which shows that how leisure and active involvement of older adults is happening in a particular segment, upper middle class society in urban India. We also see that how leisure has been emerging as self-care. So among my informants, we recorded that how there is this aspiration towards serious leisure as opposed to casual leisure. And the basic difference between two would be serious leisure require more engagement and commitment. For example, many of my informants would say that they are actively trying to learn new languages or learning digital technologies. And it was unsurprising that the leisure definitely was gendered, the kind of leisure that men performed and the kind of leisure that women performed. Men were more into passive leisure, doing things alone, while women engaged more in social form of leisure. And so definitely there was this gender concept to it. And although this was a very small sample size, we also corroborated the findings from the recent Indian time use study that was released last year. And where we saw similar patterns. And a few months back, we also worked on a paper where we discussed how leisure can be seen as a way of resistance. And this discussion around leisure and not taking leisure at the face value emerges because the data was showing how it varied across social differentials. And also this idea of how leisure allows us to see the different inequities that exist within households. For example, who gets the right to enjoy leisure? Who has the time to enjoy leisure? Who is not occupied by the household work? So it allows us to see the existing power relations in the society. And particularly for this paper, we saw that how leisure is emerging as a form of self-care. And through this focus on self-care and consumerism, we are able to shift our trajectory of understanding older adults in new ways as an alternative way where older adults are focused on enhancing their subjective well-being. And we also saw that self-care is pluralistic in nature, that there's no one way of defining how people would take care of themselves in terms of the activities or the practices they did. And nonetheless, although there were differences, we also saw across the 30 samples that how the gender differences imitated these patriarchal ideologies of separate spheres of care and leisure among men and women. And these were active older adults or active older individuals who were involved in their own lives. For them, dependence on family was only as a safety net, as opposed to the older adults as passive observers of potential decline. And it, in a way, embodies the neoliberal logic of self-reliance as independent and active older adults, which are self-relied and self-regulating themselves. And overall, the study or the working paper tries to provide an empirical evidence towards this very nature of an emerging third age cohort in India. So yeah, that was it from my side. Thank you. Thank you for listening.
Fantastic, Ashwin. Thank you very much. Okay, so I'm going to respond just a little, and then I'm going to open it up to chats, in the chat to questions and any comments. So as we're discussing, if people want to start putting their comments and questions into the chat box, that would be great, and I'll post them to our panel. So, I mean, it seemed to me that this fantastic set of papers, some really kind of interesting empirical work in some fascinating settings, was really about the tensions, the way that difference plays out in the domestic sphere, particularly in the realm of care. And with Irmak, it was to do with kind of ethnicity, national identity and gender, and the various tensions and how those tensions are negotiated. With Cecilie's, the kind of a classic tension between heterosexual couples and married couples and work and women, and how that's playing out at the moment. in Pakistan. And then Ashwin herself touched on this notion of self-care, and I really like this idea of leisure as resistance. And again, the tension there, which has kind of gendered dimensions too. A couple of you mentioned the pandemic and how those tensions are being intensified around the kind of questions of care and the politics of care, something that we at the Care Collective have been kind of very kind of preoccupied with. The first question that I think I'm going to pose to you guys perhaps is more relevant to Cecilie and Ashwin, but Irmak, if there's anything that you feel you want to contribute, please do. It's around this question of resistance. So for Ashwin, I'm really, this concept of self-care is a really fascinating one and a kind of paradoxical one if we consider its history within Black feminism and Audre Lorde's conceptualization of the term as self-care as a sort of politics, right? And so I can see a connection there with your idea of leisure as resistance, but you're framing this in with kind of neoliberalism and the kind of neoliberal self and how that's playing out in India in a particular way. And I just wondered if you might speak a little bit more to the paradoxes and how those kind of contradictory definitions came out in your research. And then also I was going to say to Cecilie, you know, the picture you're painting is in a context which I'm not familiar with, but the picture is familiar because we see similar, you know, patterns in lots of different places. And I'm just wondering if there was if you could talk a bit about any sort of resistance from the women that you spoke to, any sort of organized activism that they may have been involved with or been kind of conversant with. So yeah, it's really around the question of resistance. And again, Irmak, if you have anything that you think is relevant, that would be great. So maybe Ashwin, if you want to go first.
Thanks, Jamie, for the question. Yeah, so my entry point for the project or for the discussion around leisure is to understand this very nature of how people try to understand leisure, especially from a global south perspective where leisure itself is having blurred boundaries between productive and unproductive labor. How do you define leisure? In fact, in terms of translating leisure to people in India, to my informants, I was also put in a very critical situation of how do you define leisure? Is leisure free time? And in the process of collecting data, I realized that how my informants differentiated between leisure and free time, where leisure had something more productive in nature. It was not just unproductively enjoying the time, while free time was something that you do nothing at all. But then also the question came that where females or women women informants would say that obviously they do not get enough free time, and that is the way of how they try to work around where they talk about serious leisure, because once they now they are coming in an older adult cohort and they have less family responsibilities and they are trying to negotiate their time through serious leisure. For example, taking classes or having more commitment towards the different activities that they do, which they could not do in their earlier lives. And that is their resistance or their way of resisting towards the already the ideologies that they themselves have experienced before, but because of the age provide an emancipatory angle to the whole discussion. And similarly, I try to focus on both age and leisure and how it is providing a very different picture of the new ways of aging in India.
Okay, great, thank you. Cecilie.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't say that any of the people I talked to were involved in any type of formal activism, but some of them did call themselves feminists. Not all of them, but some of them did sort of admit to being feminists. Just the fact of trying to insist on the right to work was also their form of activism, and in their private lives, this was, you know, the way they were trying to influence their mothers to make sure because it was through the mother that they would have tried to extract promises from suitors that they would be allowed to work after marrying. And so that's, you know, sort of a form of resistance, just trying to kind of change the paradigm from that angle. And then none of the people I talked to had tried to do this, but I've heard of some people who even have tried to include it in their marriage contract, that they would be allowed to work after marrying. So there are various ways of resisting it that way, which is much more like an everyday kind of resistance. But in terms of like leisure, for example, I mean, a lot of I like the idea of leisure as resistance also, but like, I mean, when you have children and you have a job and you have housework, like who has time to resist through leisure? Like it's just, children need to be fed, you know, money has to be made. It's just, there's not much choice.
Yeah. Claire Walsh is asking Cecilie a question. Cecilie, you mentioned the value of respectability versus the gains from women's incomes. Is the gender pay gap significant in this? That even in professions, women's wages are lower than men, so their labour doesn't bring material improvement in the household?
Yeah, the short answer to that is yes. It's, I mean, obviously, because in Pakistan also, it's very limited the kind of professions that women go into and where it's respectable for them to be in. But there's a lot of teaching, being doctors. Well, those are the main jobs that they can have, really, and still, you know, be considered respectable. But teaching is you know, as everywhere, badly paid, and usually it's also part-time work. And even when they work as doctors, they usually end up taking part-time work or doing teaching medicine. So yeah, the jobs that women do are usually badly paid, and obviously that doesn't really bring a significant income to the household, and therefore it's not as interesting to get the income rather than the respectability of having a woman staying at home.
Sure. So just quickly before I go to another question, Essie has just come in and asked, what kind of jobs are the men doing in your study?
So it's everything from like sort of mid-low level government jobs, doctors, a lot of white collar kind of service industry jobs. A lot of them were engineers or you know, computer scientists working in software development, and so on. And that's also something that women are going into now. A lot of these middle-class women are becoming engineers and software engineers, what is called software engineers. Yeah, so they're also going into this field. But that's why also a lot of these men were able to work from home during the pandemic, because a lot of them had office jobs where they were working from a computer.
Okay, great. Okay, thank you. Ashwin, I've got to scroll back up. There's a question from you from Ayman. Were there any sort of demographic variabilities in the sample?
In terms of age also, there was this range from 55 and above, 55 to 80 years old, but particularly for this paper, we included people who were 65 and above, so 65 and above and till 80 years old. This was the age component. In terms of the demographic variability, we had the individuals from urban setup, and the differences were in terms of measuring the class, there's no one way of measuring class. So we focused on the income variable, and the differences were also in terms of the education and their occupation.
Thank you. Okay, so I see that Paras has their hand up. Paras, if you'd like to turn on your microphone and ask the question.
Yes, thank you so much, Jamie. And of course, thanks to the presenters for a really wonderful set of presentations. I have two questions, one for Cecilie and one for Ashwin. Cecilie, I had a methodological question. I was wondering if respectability and honor did not only come up in the interviews, but also inform the kind of answers that you received during the interviews. As somebody who has experienced, interviewing, middle-class women about their working aspirations in India, I've often seen that women often represented their husbands as the exceptional caring husbands, precisely because they wanted to maintain the notion of honor with the interviewer. And they would say, it's because of the kinship and it's because of this government that I can't work. My husband is fine though. So I was just wondering, have you thought about that? And whether it's truly important to think about it, especially in today's context with Pakistan, where we see the rise of caring, reform, so-called reform masculinities in daily soap operas, where husbands are often presented as extremely caring. So, it's a difficult way to access the truth of that, how reformed is that masculinity? And the question for Ashwin is excellently done, research, Ashwin. I was wondering if your interlocutors talked a little bit about this popular perception that we have in India right now, a popular idea that's coming up again and again, which is the indispensability of older lives, especially during a second wave, where there is one thing that's said again and again, that older people have lived enough, now it's time for you to go. There are these kind of references in popular culture. And how did that contradict with the idea of the third age, where this is the time which is imagined as a time of leisure and health and aspiration? So yeah, these two questions.
Should I go first? So yeah, you're absolutely right about that. I mean, like, it's just crazy how everybody's father or husband is like the best husband or father in the world. And like all men in Pakistan, according to like informants, like all men in Pakistan are horrible, are really unfair, treat women really badly, except mine. So it's just, and all fathers are really oppressive and like, don't let their daughters do what they want, but mine is different. So there's a huge, I mean, which is very, very interesting. It's because there's a huge disconnect, obviously, between reality and what people are saying. This is actually one of the things I'm struggling with in the thesis that I'm writing, because also I talked to a lot of men who were quite progressive, who wanted a more equal relationship with their wives, a more sort of companionate marriage, as they call it now in the literature, and who were sort of, some of them call themselves feminists, a lot of them wanted different types of a different type of masculinity going forward, and so on. So but then I interviewed a lot of women who said that actually when they get married, they all revert to type. So there's definitely a gap there, but I think it's a very important aspect of this middle class educated masculinity to kind of portray yourself as a supporter of some form of gender equality, even though that may be defined differently by different people. But I think it says more about upward mobility and middle class aspirations than necessarily about what happens in real life. So I think portrayal is a lot about creating sort of a middle class identity.
Thanks, Parveen, for the question. I do agree, and that was something that also worried me. And it was not just after the second wave, but also after, if you remember, after the first wave, there was this Twitter hashtag that was very popular, which was COVID is boomer remover. When I was collecting my data, and the data was collected after the first wave, and it finished off in February. But in terms of putting themselves in vulnerable situation, I did not find that they were very conscious of and in fact, some of the informants were so conscious when I said that I'm collecting data on older adults, and they would say that I don't consider myself old. I'm 65 years old, very active, and I'm very independent, able to do things on my own. So this discussion or this line, this thread of thought did not even emerge when they said that the only aspect in terms of the pandemic was that how their life has become very restricted. They're not able to go outside. They're not able to do their weekly routines. So that was it. And also because I think this mindset or this discussion did not come because they were very actively engaging and they were very active in their activities. So this indispensability of their own presence did not emerge in the discussion. I hope I answered your question.
Great, thanks. Jules, you have your hand up. Would you like to ask a question?
I would like to ask a question. Yes, I'll put my hand down. very quickly because we're running out of time, but I just found all of your papers so interesting, and I wondered if you could talk a bit about how you ended up doing the research that you're doing.
In terms of the methods that I did, it was because it was done with, during the pandemic. I started with circulating surveys on WhatsApp group, on the community WhatsApp groups, emailing people and stonewalling and getting the samples. And wherever possible, and when the wave was low, I only once in a while I could go and meet my informants, but it was mainly telephonic or online.
Thanks, Ashwin. And Cecilie, I was wondering about your positionality in context of the research, because you said you were there experiencing some of the same issues. How do you think that affected your experience of conducting the research and kind of your findings?
Well, I mean, certainly in terms of this paper, I think that the reason I wanted to write it in the first place was because I was experiencing a lot of the same issues myself with, you know, sort of work-life conflict and lack of childcare and duties at home and so on. But like, I mean, I'm married to a Pakistani, so I was living there with a Pakistani husband, talking to a lot of men about masculinity and talking to a lot of women about masculinity and how men acted. But because my husband comes from a different kind of class background, and a lot of my participants, it felt like sort of exploring a new sort of set of people in Pakistan that I didn't really know that well from before, because I spent the last 15 years going back and forth to Pakistan, so I knew the rural working class very well, and I knew the upper class quite well. But being a foreigner really seemed to help with men, because they were very eager to talk to me and open up to me. Like, a lot of them sort of completely opened up about their sort of private problems and so on, which I'm not sure they would have been able to do with a Pakistani female. So I think the fact that I was a complete outsider really helped in talking to men. Yeah, so I think that's about it.
Thanks so much, everyone. I'll leave it to Jamie to wrap up.
Okay, great, Jules, thank you. And thank you for those 3 fantastic papers, very kind of stimulating in different ways, particularly like the idea of silence and leisure as resistance. So thank you, guys, and thank you, Jules. And this has been a fantastic session for me. And I think the rest of the conference is going to be fantastic. So I'll leave you to all that.